In the waning light of late afternoon, the town of Redwater lay empty and silent. The adobe buildings, weathered by decades of blistering sun and gusting desert winds, perched along the dusty main street like sentinels of some forgotten age. At the edge of town, where the corral met the parched earth, a lone figure moved with deliberate purpose. Alara Rowe stood tall despite the weight of her leather apron, her blacksmith's hammer slung across her broad back, its handle worn smooth by countless hours of use. Her raven hair, tied high to keep it from her eyes, caught the dying glow of sunbeams, giving her an almost halo, an ironic crown for a woman whose days were defined by the forging of steel, from the moment she had arrived in Redwater 6 months. Earlier, Alara had drawn the curiosity and scorn of its inhabitants. A one-eyed blacksmith in a town where men preferred their women idle and demure was an anomaly, but Alara thrived on the clang of metal and the roar of the forge. She had named her shop the Iron Widow, a nod both to her own solitude and the widow's peak of determination that set her apart. She wore her singular eye like a badge of honor, a coal-black orb framed by a jagged scar, a story she never told, though it was etched in every line of her face. That afternoon, as the sun sank behind distant mesas, Alara paused at the door of her shop. She wiped sweat from her brow and surveyed the street. It was silent, too silent. Most days, a scattering of townsfolk went about their business, and the clatter of hooves on wooden planks was a familiar soundtrack. But today, not even the wind dared to whisper through the idle tumbleweeds. She returned to her forge, stoked the fire to a fierce orange, and caught sight of her reflection in the brass bellows. The edge of her leather glove was singed. Her left arm bore the faint line of a healed burn. She flexed her right hand, the one that gripped her hammer. Her lost eye had been replaced long ago by a simple glass prosthetic glazed icy white, yet it never failed to give strangers pause. Alara reached for a piece of raw steel, heavy and unyielding. As she slid it into the roaring furnace, memories flickered. The day she lost her eye, standing amidst the ruins of a wagon fire. The promise she made to herself to take control of her fate. And the hammer that became an extension of her will. She exhaled, breath steadying, and struck the glowing steel with a force that sang through the anvil like thunder. She had come here seeking solace in solitude, but solitude had a way of inviting trouble. Across the street, in front of the Lucky Strike Saloon, a group of roughnecks gathered Redwater's self-styled desperados. They leaned against the battered boards, spurred boots scuffing the planks, staring at Alara's shop with a mix of amusement and contempt. Among them was Silas Crowder, the gang's leader, his lank black hair falling into eyes that glinted with malice. "Alara the widow's making knives again," he muttered, voice low and oily. "That she can't handle her whiskey," another drawled. Silas straightened, spat a wad of tobacco. "Let's remind her why a woman's place is inside, not plying her trade in this man's world." He tossed a flask to one of his men, who caught it with a crooked grin. The flask gleamed, its contents dark and potent. Cheers rose quietly. But for Alara, the clang of her hammer rang louder. Inside the shop, Alara paused. She sensed the shift, the electric current of ill intent that crackled beyond her open doors. Her glass eye flicked to the window, where she glimpsed the silhouettes. She knew the law in Redwater was as useful as a broken spur, and its sheriff was often found leaning on his own bar, rather than protecting the innocent. With a deep breath, Alara set aside her hammer and wiped her hands on her rough cloth. She stepped outside, dust swirling around her boots, and faced the men. Her one good eye met Silas's gaze. "Girls like me don't take kindly to mockery," she called, voice unwavering. Silas laughed, low and derisive. "Oh, we're not mocking you, widow. We're here to teach you a lesson about respect." A hush fell, the kind that presses against the lung. In the waning light of late afternoon, the town of Redwater lay empty and silent. The adobe buildings, weathered by decades of blistering sun and gusting desert winds, perched along the dusty main street like sentinels of some forgotten age. At the edge of town, where the corral met the parched earth, a lone figure moved with deliberate purpose. Alara Rowe stood tall despite the weight of her leather apron, her blacksmith's hammer slung across her broad back, its handle worn smooth by countless hours of use. Her raven hair, tied high to keep it from her eyes, caught the dying glow of sunbeams, giving her an almost halo, an ironic crown for a woman whose days were defined by the forging of steel, from the moment she had arrived in Redwater 6 months earlier. Alara had drawn the curiosity and scorn of its inhabitants. A one-eyed blacksmith in a town where men preferred their women idle and demure was an anomaly, but Alara thrived on the clang of metal and the roar of the forge. She had named her shop the Iron Widow, a nod both to her own solitude and the widow's peak of determination that set her apart. She wore her singular eye like a badge of honor, a coal-black orb framed by a jagged scar, a story she never told, though it was etched in every line of her face. That afternoon, as the sun sank behind distant mesas, Alara paused at the door of her shop. She wiped sweat from her brow and surveyed the street. It was silent, too silent. Most days, a scattering of townsfolk went about their business, and the clatter of hooves on wooden planks was a familiar soundtrack. But today, not even the wind dared to whisper through the idle tumbleweeds. She returned to her forge, stoked the fire to a fierce orange, and caught sight of her reflection in the brass bellows. The edge of her leather glove was singed. Her left arm bore the faint line of a healed burn. She flexed her right hand, the one that gripped her hammer. Her lost eye had been replaced long ago by a simple glass prosthetic glazed icy white. Yet it never failed to give strangers pause. Alara reached for a piece of raw steel, heavy and unyielding. As she slid it into the roaring furnace, memories flickered. The day she lost her eye, standing amidst the ruins of a wagon fire. The promise she made to herself to take control of her fate. And the hammer that became an extension of her will. She exhaled, breath steadying, and struck the glowing steel with a force that sang through the anvil like thunder. She had come here seeking solace in solitude, but solitude had a way of inviting trouble. Across the street, in front of the Lucky Strike Saloon, a group of roughnecks gathered Redwater's self-styled desperados. They leaned against the battered boards, spurred boots scuffing the planks, staring at Alara's shop with a mix of amusement and contempt. Among them was Silas Crowder, the gang's leader, his lank black hair falling into eyes that glinted with malice. "Alara the widow's making knives again," he muttered, voice low and oily. "That she can't handle her whiskey," another drawled. Silas straightened, spat a wad of tobacco. "Let's remind her why a woman's place is inside, not plying her trade in this man's world." He tossed a flask to one of his men, who caught it with a crooked grin. The flask gleamed, its contents dark and potent. Cheers rose quietly. But for Alara, the clang of her hammer rang louder. Inside the shop, Alara paused. She sensed the rain fell in heavy sheets, turning Redwater's dusty streets into rivers of mud and memory. Inside the Iron Widow, the glow from Alara Rowe's forge danced across her soot-streaked face as she worked the bellows, coaxing warm life back into the coals. Outside, thunder rolled like distant gunfire, a reminder of the night's violence and the power she wielded. She paused, hammer still in hand, and let the hammer's weight settle in her palm, pulse echoing in the rhythm of the anvil. She remembered the scent of spilled whiskey, the sharp crack when her hammer met bone, and the way Silas Crowder's eyes widened with respect before he fled. That moment, brief as a heartbeat, proved more enduring than any legend she might forge in song. But victory carried its own burden. Every breath she drew felt laden with the weight of expectation, every heartbeat a ticking clock until the next challenge. Ilara slid the red-hot steel from the forge and laid it on the anvil. Sparks spat into the darkness, illuminating the stacks of half-finished blades and horseshoes scattered around the shop. For 6 months, this place had been her sanctuary, a refuge from the past. Now it was her proving ground. She took a deep breath, inhaling the coppery tang of hot metal and old leather, and struck the steel with deliberate, powerful blows. Each hit sang with purpose, each echo reverberating through her bones as she worked. Her mind drifted to the townsfolk who had gathered at the edges of the street, watching. Faces blurred by rain and distance, but their eyes were fixed on her, a one-eyed woman standing alone against a gang of violent men. Some looked on with admiration, others with lingering mistrust. Redwater had always been wary of outsiders. Ilara had felt their suspicion in every sideways glance and whispered rumor. Now some of that doubt had been swept away, carried off by Silas's retreat. But a deeper test awaited winning their trust, stitching the rift between fear and respect. A knock at the door jolted her back to the present. She wiped her hands on a rag, the fabric stained dark, and swung the heavy wooden door open. Sheriff Cole sat astride his weary horse, brim of his hat pulled low. His badge was dull with tarnish, his once proud uniform wrinkled by too many late nights in dark taverns. He looked at her through the curtain of rain, face tight with unease. "Ms. Rowe," he called over the storm, "I heard about last night." He spat into the mud. "You handled yourself well. Reckon you saved half the town from a real mess." Ilara met his gaze, but her expression stayed steel. "I did what needed doing. Those men would have come back, Sheriff. Redwater deserved better." He dismounted and moved forward, boots squelching in the muck. "Ain't many women I'd see wield a hammer like that. I owe you an apology for doubting you." He hesitated, then added, "and for not being here sooner. My deputy and I we were stretched thin." Her single eye studied him. "Apologies don't mend broken bones, Sheriff. But thanks. If you spread word, it'll help more than empty words." In the saloon, he nodded, as if bidden to do so. "Consider it done." He straightened, rain dripping off his hat brim. "I'll send word to Carson City. They'll hear of how the Iron Widow stands at Redwater's edge. Should keep trouble away. For a spell." Ilara closed the door in his face and returned to the forge, heart beating too fast. Trust was as fragile as tempered steel. One wrong strike could shatter it. But the sheriff's respect, honest and grudging, was a start. She resumed hammering, the glowing steel shaping a new blade whose rhythm seemed to match her thoughts. When the form was right, she quenched it in water, steam hissing like wounded spirits. She lifted the blade from the bath, cold droplets spattering her leather gauntlet, and sharpened its edge on a whetstone. In the reflection on the stone's slick surface, her glass eye gleamed like a widow's lantern in the night, guiding those who dared to follow her path. Late into the evening, the last of the rain trickled off the shop's tin roof. Ilara coiled the newly forged blade in a leather strip, another dead man's whisper, though she would keep it, not sell it. It was a reminder, a weapon to protect, not to menace. She set it above her workbench, alongside the other fine blades awaiting their owners. The forge's embers died to red coals as she doused the fire, letting memories smolder in the quiet. Slippers of moonlight slipped under the door as she locked the shop. The world beyond was washed clean by rain, the mud settling into ruts and grooves. She climbed onto her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Cinder, and rode toward home, the soft creak of saddle leather the only sound. Under the moon, Redwater looked peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But Ilara knew the truth. Change was in the wind, and once tempered steel clashed with human cruelty. It never returned to equilibrium. She reached her small cabin on the town's edge, no grand hall or gilded sanctuary, just a modest haven built from weathered wood and rough stone. Cinder whinnied, shaking out her mane, and Ilara climbed down, patting the mare's neck. She tethered Cinder at the stable, feeding her oats, then returned inside. The cabin's hearth was cold, embittered by neglect. Ilara stoked a small fire, sending sparks drifting skyward through the chimney. She fetched a simple clay cup of whiskey, the sting a comfort after steel and blood, and sat in the candlelight, letting exhaustion pull at her. Memories tugged. The day she lost her eye. The feel of ragged cloth pressing into her socket. The faces of men who had sneered at her, then stepped back when she refused to be cowed. Her thumb traced the scar beneath her prosthetic eye. The world had tried to write her story for her, fill her with doubts, doubts she had defeated with every strike of her hammer. Now in the hush of her cabin, she let herself feel the ache in her shoulder, the thrill of triumph and the weight of responsibility that came with it. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the road leading into the desert. The horizon was pinched by distant mountains, their peaks ghostly in the moonlight. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the storm, whispers of her deeds would spread some praising, some warning. But she knew that acts, once done, took on lives of their own. She was no myth maker, but reality had a way of outpacing legends. A rap on the door made her pause. She grabbed her hammer, always within reach, and opened it a crack. Sheriff Cole stood in the moonlight, water streaming from his coat. "Mind if I disturb your peace, Ms. Rowe?" he asked, voice low. Ilara stepped back, eye narrowing. "You're late, Sheriff." He held up a hand. "Got a rider from Carson City. They're sending Deputy Grayson with reinforcements 2 weeks out. Wanted you to know, and to ask if you'd consider leaving a weapon here. Keep the peace, Ms. Rowe, but the town needs a night guard." Her jaw tightened. 2 weeks was too long. But the sheriff's look, hopeful yet wary, told her the town counted on her. She glanced at her hammer in her hand, then back at him. "I'll think on it," she replied, voice steady. "But you'll do your part too. No more empty words." He nodded. "On my honor." As he rode off, Ilara closed the door and leaned against it, breath uneven. Guilt flared. Turning away meant abandoning the people who had already put their faith in her. Yet staying meant endless vigilance, the hammer forever in hand, the weight of a town on her shoulders. She set the hammer on the table and moved to the table's corner, where a parchment lay unrolled. It was a map of the territory, ink lines, marking trails, outposts, and danger zones. She traced a finger along a route to the next settlement, Dry Creek, hollow where a desperate plea for weapons had arrived weeks ago. Her forge had gone silent for them. The request had sat unanswered amid Redwater's turmoil. Now she could not ignore it. The candle flickered, shadows dancing across the map as her resolve hardened. She would not be a solitary avenger forever. The anvil's song had always guided her, but purpose was a broader melody, one that called her beyond Redwater's limits. Ilara picked up her hammer and slung it across her back. She filled her satchel with rations, a flask of whiskey, and a length of fire-hardened wire-simple tools for a journey into the untamed wilds. She paused at the window once more, breathing in the cold air. The horizon's darkness beckoned. With one last look at her cabin, she slipped into the night. Cinder whinnied as she mounted, hooves silent on the wet earth. As they vanished down the road, the moon dipped behind clouds, leaving only the faint glow of dawn's promise. Some journeys began with a single step. Hers began with a hammer's strike, forging her fate in steel, fire, and unyielding will. And as the desert wind carried her away, Redwater's shadows receded, replaced by the forging heat of a legend reborn. Ilara rode through the pre-dawn darkness, the horizon's pale glow guiding her steps like a promise. Behind her, Redwater slept beneath a blanket of stars, its quiet streets ignorant of the powerful currents her presence had set in motion. Ahead lay Dry Creek Hollow, a settlement of weary travelers and settlers, perched on the edge of the desert. They had sent word weeks ago, desperate for weapons and blades, their blacksmith long since fled. Ilara's heart tightened at the memory of their plea. She had answered the call now, armed with forge-hardened steel and the resolve of a woman who had learned that true strength lay in forging hope for others. As the trail wound through rocky canyons, the sand shifting beneath Cinder's hooves like broken glass. Each step carried Alara farther from the familiarity of Redwater and closer to the unknown. Her thoughts danced between strategy and memory, how Silas Crowder's men had fled before her hammer, how the sheriff's reluctant respect had shown the thin line between fear and trust, and how her own solitude had hardened into purpose. She carried Dead Man's whisper at her side and her hammer behind her, physical extensions of her will. As dawn approached, the sky bled into streaks of crimson and slate. Alara halted on a high ridge, surveying the valley below where Dry Creek Hollow lay. Smoke curled from its chimneys like a beacon. But as she squinted, horror made her gut twist. The smoke was thick and acrid, not from hearth fires but from burning buildings. Black plumes curled into the sky, and faint, desperate cries carried on the wind. Cinder whinnied, sensing her tension. Alara urged her forward, riding down the slope at a brisk gallop. The closer she drew, the more obvious the devastation. Charred timber, collapsed roofs, and scattered bodies. Survivors huddled in clusters, faces streaked with ash and tears, clutching what little possessions remained. At the settlement's edge, a handful of armed men, ragged, exhausted, guarded the perimeter, but they looked defeated rather than vigilant. Alara slid from her saddle, heart pounding. She approached the nearest guard, a young man with hollowed cheeks and eyes too old for his face. His pistol hung loosely at his hip. His rifle leaned against a battered wagon. "I'm Alara Rowe," she called, voice firm above the moan of wind. "I heard your call and came to help. What happened here?" He blinked at her name, then relief flickered. "The Iron Widow? By God, we thought we were lost. Raiders came at dawn, ghosts, riding black horses, blades like demons' tongues. They slaughtered anyone who tried to fight, burned us out." He swallowed. "They took our blacksmith and several others. We barely escaped." Rage seethed beneath Alara's calm. "Show me where. I'll make them regret this." He hesitated, then turned. "We tried, but they outnumbered us and moved like shadows." Alara nodded, assessing the scene. The settlement's smithy lay in ruins, a collapsed roof, a shattered forge, embers long since cold. She felt the weight of loss settle on her shoulders. These people had been driven to desperation, their only defense gone, yet despair would not answer steel. "Gather your people," she instructed. "Find safe cover. I need space to work, and we'll need to talk strategy." The man hesitated but followed orders, rounding up survivors as Alara strode into the wreckage. She knelt by the ruined anvil, running a gloved hand over its scorched surface. A half-finished blade lay buried in rubble, its tip broken. She lifted it, examining the damage and the crude craftsmanship. "This was your blacksmith's work?" she asked. He nodded, crestfallen. He was young but good. Learned by his father's side, cursed by these lands. Alara studied the blade. He had promise. "Which is why I won't let his efforts die here. Get me that broken chain, the scrap iron near the stable, and as much hardwood as you can find. I'll need tools." By mid-morning, the survivors formed a ragtag assembly. Women cleared debris. Men retrieved metal scraps and children fetched water. Alara oversaw them all, her presence sparking a glimmer of hope. She set to work rebuilding the forge using stones from the stable, a makeshift bellows crafted from an old blanket, and the anvil's battered base. Sparks flew as she hammered and coaxed the fire to life, the heat a promise that all was not lost. As the sun climbed high, a low rumble echoed from the canyon mouth. Alara wiped sweat from her brow, senses alert. She laid aside her hammer and drew Dead Man's whisper, its blade flashing as she tested the edge. The survivors paused, fear surfacing once more. She turned, addressing them. "They'll come again," she said, voice steady. And next time we'll be ready. Those who took your smithy won't expect the Iron Widow. Behind her, the ramshackle smithy stood reborn, a crucible of red-hot steel and determination. She threw a fresh billet into the fire, its glow a beacon of defiance. The survivors watched, awe replacing despair. Moments later, the raiders appeared silhouettes against the canyon's rim. 8 riders, blades drawn. They spurred their mounts forward, confidence in their ranks as they rode to finish the settlement's destruction. Elara stepped forward, hammer in one hand, blade in the other, firelight dancing across her scarred face. The survivors formed. Behind her, arms raised, pitchforks, broken rifles, and makeshift clubs in hand. "Come as you are," Elara called. "All of us stand together now. And we will not fall." The raiders hesitated, taken aback by the sight of one woman and a band of survivors transformed by sheer will. The canyon echoed with the thunder of hooves, yet this time, hope rode at the front. The first rider charged. Elara met him at the edge of the debris field, hammer swinging in a practiced arc that cracked like a gunshot. He reined back, stunned by the force. Then she shifted to the blade, dead man's whisper, arcing through the air, meeting steel with steel in a shower of sparks. The survivor behind her pressed forward, brandishing a butcher's cleaver. Chaos erupted. The settlement's defenders rallied, driving the raiders back with coordinated strikes and unexpected tenacity. Elara moved through the fray like liquid shadow, her hammer opening gaps in the raiders' lines, her blade cutting through fear and doubt. But amid the clash, Elara's glass eye caught movement, a rider spurring his horse to flank her position. She turned to face him, fearless, resolute. Their blades met, sparks flying. She sensed the rider's hesitation, his disbelief that a one-eyed woman could stand her ground. With a swift feint, she drew him off balance, then struck not to kill, but to disarm. The raider's sword clattered to the ground as he stumbled, chest heaving. Around them, the tide had turned. The survivors pressed their advantage, driving the remaining raiders from the canyon. As silence fell, broken by ragged breaths and the crackle of the dying forge, Elara stood amidst the survivors. Their eyes shone with something new, gratitude, respect, and the fierce light of people who had found their strength. She sheathed dead man's whisper and returned the damaged blade to the anvil. "We rebuild," she declared, "and we forge our own destiny." The survivors cheered, voices rising above the canyon. Elara allowed herself a thin smile before turning back to her forge. Sparks danced once again in the afternoon sun, and the hammer sang its triumphant song. In the aftermath, as the survivors tended their wounded and salvaged their homes, Elara set to the work of reforging the broken blade. Each strike on the anvil was a promise that no one would be left defenseless again, that hope could be reforged stronger than steel, and that the legend of the Iron Widow would spread not as a tale of vengeance, but as a beacon of resilience. Under the scorching sun, the beat of hammer on steel echoed through Dry Creek Hollow, a new melody for a new chapter, one forged in fire, tempered by unity, and driven by the indomitable will of a one-eyed blacksmith who would not be broken. Elara's journey between Redwater and Dry Creek Hollow had become a corridor of hope, yet its path twisted into fresh peril as the wind changed. The morning sun rose over the rugged cliffs, illuminating a landscape still scarred by last night's attack. As she rode east toward the abandoned mining outpost of Copper Spur, the blistering heat pressed against her leather apron, and her thoughts turned to the letter she carried, a plea from Copper Spur's council begging for arms, protection, and above all a leader. The letter, scrawled in hurried ink, spoke of dwindling water supplies, an outbreak of disease, and bandits who took advantage of the desperate and sick. It arrived in Redwater the day before her departure, carried by a breathless rider who collapsed at her feet, whispering of horrors that had driven half the town into the desert, seeking refuge that did not exist. She inhaled, scent of sage and sun-warmed rock filling her lungs, and urged Cinder onward. The trail to Copper Spur wound through a canyon painted with ochre and russet, where the wind hummed through pines like morning songs. The ache in her shoulder throbbed a reminder of her skirmishes, but she ignored it, focusing on the task. Ahead, midday found her cresting a ridge overlooking Copper Spur's makeshift stockade, a ring of hastily erected timber walls, blackened by smoke and battered by storms. Beyond its gates lay the town's heart, a tangle of tents and half-collapsed cabins. No sign of life stirred, save the flutter of tattered banners and the distant bleat of goats. Ilara dismounted and approached the gate, hammer in hand, eyes scanning for threats. A figure emerged, an old man draped in stained linens, cradling a makeshift staff. His eyes were sunken, his cheeks gaunt. "You're the Iron Widow," he rasped. She nodded, swallowing dust. "I came as fast as I could." His jaw tightened. "Too slow. They came at Dawn Disease first, and then the bandits. They slaughtered those who fell sick, then took what they wanted, leaving the rest to die." Ilara's blood chilled. "Show me where." Inside the stockade, the stench of rot greeted her. Bodies lay where they had fallen, draped in blankets stained with fever's toll. A few survivors emerged hollow-eyed, clutching water skins. Ilara's tough resolve wavered for a moment as grief and anger collided in her chest. "We rebuild, we fight, or we die," she declared, voice steady. "First, we secure water and medicine. Then, we make these bandits regret coming here." The old man led her to the broken well. Its pulley snapped, its bucket twisted. Ilara knelt, inspecting the mechanism. "I can fix this, but I need tools and men." She stood, addressing the survivors. "Who among you can help a blacksmith rebuild hope?" They exchanged glances, uncertainty warring with need. At her nod, a dozen stepped forward, farmers, former miners, and a few ex-soldiers, each weary but determined. Together they salvaged rope, fashioned a new pulley system, and hauled fresh water from the depths. As the well grown back to life, a cheer rose, a tremulous vow that life would endure. But their triumph was short-lived. The ground trembled under the rhythmic thud of hooves. The bandits had returned. Twice the number from the canyon rim they poured down, weapons gleaming under the harsh sun. Their leader, a scar-faced brute known as Garrick Cold, rode at their head, a dark silhouette against the sky. Ilara drew her hammer. "Line the walls!" She shouted. Survivors took positions, armed with pitchforks and rifles, the new metal pieces she had reforged at their sides. The bandits approached, confident in their numbers. Cold sneered, raising his rifle. "I thought you'd be a challenge, widow, but this?" He gestured at the ragged defense. "Pathetic." Ilara stepped forward, hammer raised high. "This is more than you'll ever know." She ran across the courtyard, charging through fire and steel. Every step a promise of retribution. Cold fired, the bullet whistling past her ear. She reached the stockade wall and slammed her hammer into it. The timber splintered, sending shards flying. With each swing, she opened a breach, igniting the spark that would ignite their courage. From above, a survivor dropped a rope line. Ilara caught it, scaling the wall as bandits scrambled to intercept. At the top, she faced Cold in single combat. Their duel was brutal, hammer against rifle butt, sparks against blood. The wind whipped dust around them as each strike echoed. Like thunder across the canyon, Cold lunged, blade raised. Ilara parried with her hammer, then struck his wrist, snapping his pistol aside. With a swift arc, she disarmed him and pressed her blade, a small, precise movement that pinned him to the stockade's palisade. "Yield," she urged, her voice a low rumble. "Your fight is with me. Leave the rest in peace." Cold's lip curled in defiance, but his eyes held defeat. He spat on the ground. "You're no legend. Just another outlaw with a pretty name." Ilara's gaze hardened. "Watch me become one." With a final twist, she shattered his nerve, and he slumped, unable to carry on. Around them, his men faltered, then dropped their weapons.